The late autumn sky was a swirl of dark clouds, casting an ominous shadow over the dense forest below. 5 friends, Sarah, Mark, Emily, David, and Liam, were on their annual camping trip, this time choosing a remote location far from the comforts of modern life. They had heard rumors about the forest, that it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had disappeared within its depths centuries ago. But to them, it was just another thrilling adventure, something to laugh about around the campfire. None of them took the story seriously. As they trekked deeper into the woods, the trees grew taller and denser, their gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. There was an odd stillness in the air, as if the forest itself were watching them. Every now and then, the wind would pick up, carrying with it the faintest whisper, a sound so subtle that it could be easily dismissed as the rustling of leaves. But Mark, ever the skeptic, felt a strange unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. "I don't like this place," he muttered, lagging behind the group. Sarah turned to him, smirking. "What's the matter, Mark? You afraid of a few old trees?" He shook his head, forcing a grin. "Nah, it's just something feels off." By the time they reached the clearing where they planned to set up camp, dusk had settled in, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The group worked quickly to pitch their tents, eager to start a fire before the darkness consumed them. As the flames crackled to life, they sat around the fire, passing around cans of beer and retelling old stories from previous trips. The mood lightened, the tension easing as they laughed and joked, the forest's strange aura momentarily forgotten. It wasn't until Emily, always the boldest, brought up the legend of the haunted forest that the eerie atmosphere returned. "You know, they say people have gone missing here," she said, her voice low and dramatic. "The locals believe it's because of the spirits of those who were murdered in these woods centuries ago. They say if you wander too far off the path, the forest swallows you whole, and you become part of it, forever." Liam scoffed. "That's just a load of superstitious nonsense, probably made up to scare people off from poaching or something." Emily grinned, her eyes glinting mischievously in the firelight. "Maybe. But do you want to test it? I dare you to go out there alone for an hour." Mark, sensing an opportunity to prove his bravery, stood up. "I'll do it," he said, grabbing a flashlight. The others protested, but he waved them off. "Come on, it's just for fun. I'll be back before you know it." Without waiting for another word, he disappeared into the trees, the beam of his flashlight growing fainter as he walked deeper into the forest. Minutes passed, then an hour. The group's laughter had long since faded, replaced by nervous glances and uneasy whispers. Sarah checked her watch for the 10th time, her brow furrowed. "He should have been back by now," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Maybe he got lost." David, always the practical one, stood up. "I'll go look for him. He probably just wandered too far." He grabbed a lantern and headed into the woods, calling Mark's name as he went. The others waited, huddled close to the fire, their nervous energy palpable. Another hour passed, and still, neither Mark nor David had returned. The forest had grown eerily quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Emily's earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a gnawing fear. "We need to find them," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." Liam nodded, though his face was pale. "We should all go together. It's not safe to split up anymore." They doused the fire and grabbed their remaining flashlights, plunging into the dark forest in search of their missing friends. The trees loomed over them like towering giants, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise amplified in the oppressive silence. They called out Mark and David's names, but their voices seemed to vanish into the darkness, swallowed by the thick canopy above. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, sending a jolt of terror through their hearts. It was Mark's voice, full of panic and pain. Without thinking, they ran toward the sound, the beam of their flashlights bouncing wildly through the trees. But when they reached the source of the scream, there was no sign of Mark, only his flashlight, lying on the ground, flickering weakly. Sarah picked it up, her hands shaking. "Where is he? He was right here!" Panic gripped them all. The forest, once seemingly alive with whispers and movement, now felt suffocating, as if the trees themselves were closing in on them. "We need to get out of here," Liam said, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave now." But the forest had other plans. As they turned to head back to camp, they realized with growing horror that the path they had taken was gone. The trees had shifted, the familiar landmarks erased. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself to trap them. Panic set in as they stumbled through the underbrush, calling out for help, but their voices only echoed back at them, distorted and mocking. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The group grew more disoriented with every step, their fear mounting as the forest seemed to toy with them. At one point they came across David's lantern, still flickering faintly on the forest floor, but there was no sign of David. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. They were being hunted. Something in the forest was watching them, stalking them, and it wasn't human. As they huddled together, exhausted and terrified, a cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper. The voice was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was all they could hear. It was calling their names. Liam, Sarah, Emily. They clamped their hands over their ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices were inside their heads now, pulling them deeper into madness. Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. What do they want? Why are they doing this? Emily, who'd been the bravest at the start, now looked pale and hollow-eyed. They're playing with us, she whispered. They want us to suffer, to lose hope. Liam, his face twisted in fear, tried to stay rational. We need to keep moving. We need to find a way out of here before it's too late. But it was already too late. As they stumbled through the endless maze of trees, they began to see things. Shadows darting between the trunks, pale figures watching them from a distance, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. At one point, they found themselves back at their own campsite, though they had no memory of how they got there. The fire was still burning, but the tents were gone, as if they had never been there at all. And then, one by one, they started to disappear. First, it was Emily. She wandered away from the group, drawn by the sound of her own name being called from the shadows. By the time they realized she was gone, it was too late. They searched for her, but all they found was her backpack, lying abandoned at the base of a tree. Next was Liam. He had been the strongest of them, but even he couldn't resist the pull of the forest. He vanished without a sound, leaving Sarah all alone in the dark with only the whispering trees for company. By the time the search party arrived 3 days later, they found nothing but a single smoldering fire pit. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just the faint scent of smoke hanging in the air. The legend of the haunted forest grew that day, as yet another group of campers disappeared into its depths, never to be seen again. Some say the forest is cursed, that it feeds on the souls of the lost. Others believe it's the spirits of the dead, seeking revenge on those who dare to enter their domain. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Those who venture into the haunted forest rarely come back, and if they do, they are never the same. Jake Morrison had always been drawn to the wild, isolated parts of the world, where the air was thick with the scent of pine, and the sounds of civilization were nothing but a distant memory. For years, he had sought solitude in the forests, hiking alone for days at a time to clear his mind. So when he heard about Blackwood Forest, a vast and untouched expanse of wilderness, it seemed like the perfect escape. The locals in the nearby town warned him about the place, spinning tales of haunted woods and voices that called out to travelers in the night, but Jake had laughed it off. Superstitions weren't something he ever paid much attention to. He'd been hiking long enough to know that the only danger in the woods was getting lost or running into wild animals. Ghosts and spirits were the stuff of campfire stories, not reality. Jake arrived at the forest just as the afternoon sun began to sink behind the hills. The trees loomed overhead, ancient and gnarled, their branches twisting together to form a dense canopy that blocked out much of the light. Despite the ominous appearance of the woods, Jake felt a sense of calm wash over him as he entered. The chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot were familiar sounds, ones that had always soothed him. He hiked for hours, venturing deeper into the forest, far beyond the reach of the well-worn paths. By the time the sun had fully set, he had found a small clearing where he could set up camp. The night air was cool, and as he built a fire, The crackling flames provided both warmth and comfort. As darkness fell, Jake sat by the fire, sipping coffee from a tin cup and staring up at the stars through the breaks in the trees. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of a distant animal moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful, just the way he liked it. But as the fire began to die down and Jake prepared to turn in for the night, something strange happened. At first it was so faint that he thought he imagined it. A voice, barely more than a whisper, carried on the wind. "Jake." The sound was soft, like the murmuring of leaves, but unmistakable. He froze, his heart skipping a beat as he looked around. No one was supposed to be out here. He was miles away from any other hikers, and the remoteness of the forest made it unlikely that he'd run into anyone by accident. He stood up, scanning the tree line with his flashlight, but there was no one there. Brushing it off as the wind playing tricks on his ears, Jake returned to his tent and crawled into his sleeping bag, though a strange unease settled in his chest. As he lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of his tent, the voice came again, clearer this time. "Jake." It was a soft, almost pleading call, as if someone were standing just outside the campfire's dying embers, beckoning him into the trees. His heart pounded in his chest, and he sat up, his breath coming in short bursts. This time the voice didn't fade away. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent. "Jake, come." Jake grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cool night air. The forest was still, too still, as though the very woods were holding their breath. The wind had died down completely, and the fire had almost completely gone out, leaving the clearing in near total darkness. He shone his flashlight toward the trees, his pulse quickening as the voice called out again, this time from deeper within the woods. "Jake, over here." The rational part of his mind told him to stay put, to wait until morning before doing anything foolish. But the pull of the voice was undeniable. He had to find out where it was coming from. Against his better judgment, Jake ventured into the trees, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. As he walked, the voice seemed to move with him, always just ahead, luring him deeper into the forest. The trees around him grew denser, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, and the path became harder to follow. But Jake couldn't stop now. Something was pulling him forward, some invisible force drawing him closer to the source of the whispering. The further he went, the colder the air became, and the strange stillness of the forest only grew more oppressive. The voice was no longer soft and distant. It was close, too close. "Jake, come closer, come." He stumbled through the underbrush, his breathing ragged as fear began to creep in. The trees seemed to shift around him, closing in, their twisted trunks and gnarled branches blocking out what little light remained. His flashlight flickered, the beam faltering, as though the darkness was swallowing it whole. Jake's heart raced, and he tried to turn back, but the path had disappeared. The forest, once familiar and navigable, had transformed into a nightmarish maze. Every direction looked the same, and the voice, oh God, the voice, was everywhere now, surrounding him, coming from the trees themselves. "Jake, we've been waiting!" His legs trembled as he spun in circles, trying to find any recognizable landmark. But there was nothing, just an endless stretch of trees and shadows that moved with a life of their own. Panic clawed at his chest, and the realization hit him like a blow. He was lost, completely and utterly lost. But more than that, he wasn't alone. The whispers grew louder, more numerous, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, all calling his name. "Jake, come, come!" The flashlight finally died, plunging him into total darkness. Jake stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. And then, in the inky blackness, he saw them. Faces, pale, gaunt, and lifeless, staring out at him from the shadows. Dozens of them, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark, their mouths moving in unison, though no sound escaped their lips. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking through them, using their bodies as vessels to communicate. The faces were twisted in agony, their expressions frozen in eternal suffering. Jake tried to scream, but no sound came out. His legs gave way, and he collapsed to the forest floor, the voices now deafening in his ears. "Join us, Jake. Become one of us." The faces drew closer, their eyes boring into him, their hands reaching out from the shadows, grasping at his arms, his legs, pulling him down into the cold, damp earth. Jake fought to break free, but the roots of the forest had already claimed him. They coiled around his body, dragging him deeper into the soil, into the darkness. As the earth closed over him, the last thing Jake heard was the whispering, soft, soothing now, as if welcoming him home. And then there was nothing. No sound, no light, just the cold embrace of the forest, and the endless whispering voices that would never let him go. Days later, a search party found Jake's campsite untouched, his gear still neatly packed inside his tent. But there was no sign of him, no footprints, no trail, as though he had simply vanished. The locals shrugged when they heard the news. People always went missing in Blackwood Forest. It was just the way of things. And if you listened closely, they said, you could still hear the voices calling out, searching for the next lost soul to claim. The trees, after all, were always hungry. The sun was beginning to set when 5 friends, Lily, Sam, Matt, Jenna, and Chris, stumbled upon the old cabin nestled deep in the woods. They had been hiking all day, lost in the sprawling forest after taking a wrong turn hours earlier. Exhausted and running low on water, they were relieved to find what they assumed was an abandoned cabin, its weathered wood and crooked windows giving it a haunted, forgotten look. None of them said it out loud, but they all felt a strange unease the moment they saw it. Still, as nightfall loomed, they had little choice but to seek shelter. The cabin's door creaked loudly as they pushed it open, revealing a musty interior shrouded in shadows. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture, what little there was, looked ancient and decayed. A broken chair sat in one corner, and an old fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth cold and dark. "It's better than sleeping outside," Sam said, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over the group. The others nodded, though their expressions were tight with unease. They dropped their packs by the door and began exploring the small cabin. The first thing they noticed was that despite its dilapidated state, the cabin didn't seem entirely abandoned. Strange symbols were etched into the wooden walls, carvings that looked old, almost ritualistic. Chris ran his fingers over one of them, frowning. "What do you think these mean?" he asked, but no one had an answer. Lily, ever the skeptic, shrugged. Probably just some bored teenagers messing around. But her voice lacked conviction. Something about the place felt wrong. The air inside was thick, suffocating, and the cabin seemed to hum with a silent energy that put everyone on edge. As night fell, they decided to stay close to the fireplace, lighting a fire to ward off the cold that had begun to creep in. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the cabin, the silence was oppressive. The friends tried to talk and joke to lighten the mood, but every laugh felt forced, and the conversation quickly died down. Jenna was the first to voice what everyone else had been feeling. "I don't like this place," she said, her eyes darting to the dark corners of the cabin. "It feels like we're not alone." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to admit that they felt it too. Then, as if to confirm Jenna's fears, there came a noise from the back of the cabin, a soft, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. Everyone froze, their eyes widening in alarm. "What the hell was that?" Matt whispered, his voice tight with fear. Chris grabbed a flashlight and slowly stood up. "I'll check it out," he said, though his hands trembled as he spoke. The others protested, but he was already moving toward the noise, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He disappeared around the corner into the back room, leaving the others huddled together by the fire. Seconds stretched into minutes, and still, Chris didn't return. "He's been gone too long," Sam said, his voice barely a whisper. Fear gnawed at them, and without another word, they all stood up, grabbing their own flashlights to go after him. As they entered the back room, they found it empty, no sign of Chris. But there was something else. The window in the room had been shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. The wind whistled through the broken pane, and outside in the distance, they could see the faint flicker of a figure moving between the trees. "Chris!" Lily shouted, rushing to the window. But the figure didn't respond. It moved deeper into the forest, vanishing from view. Panic set in. "We have to go after him," Jenna said, her voice shaky, but Matt shook his head. "No way, we can't just go running into the woods at night. We'll get lost or worse." They were trapped. Stay in the cabin and wait, or venture into the dark forest to search for their friend. Neither option felt safe. As they debated what to do, the cabin itself seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching and deepening. Strange noises echoed through the walls, soft whispers barely audible, and the sound of something moving just out of sight. Then, without warning, the door to the back room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Lily screamed and they all rushed to the door, but no matter how hard they pulled, it wouldn't budge. The air in the room grew thick, and a foul stench filled the space, as though something rotting lay just beneath the floorboards. "What is happening?" Jenna cried, her voice trembling with terror. Sam backed away from the door, his eyes wide with fear. "This place, it's not right. We have to get out of here now." But before they could make a move, the lights from their flashlights flickered and then died all at once, plunging the room into complete darkness. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, suffocating silence. And then they heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the other side of the room. Lily's breath caught in her throat as the growling grew louder, closer. In the pitch black, she could hear something dragging across the floor, inching toward them. She fumbled for her flashlight, desperate to turn it back on. When she finally managed to flick the switch, the beam illuminated a horrifying sight. In the corner of the room, crouched low to the ground, was a figure, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. It stared at them, its mouth curling into a grotesque smile. Matt swore loudly, grabbing Jenna by the arm and yanking her toward the door. "We need to go now," he shouted. They rushed for the door, pulling it open and racing into the front room. But the creature was fast, too fast. It moved like a blur, skittering across the floor, its long fingers scraping the wooden planks as it chased after them. They barely made it through the front door before slamming it shut behind them, their hearts pounding in their chests. Outside, the cold wind bit at their skin, but they didn't stop running. They bolted into the dark forest, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they sprinted through the trees. Behind them, they could hear the creature's raspy breathing, its footsteps pounding against the forest floor as it gave chase. They ran and ran, the forest stretching endlessly before them until finally they could run no more. They collapsed in a small clearing, gasping for air, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and fear. But the creature was gone. The forest was silent again, save for the distant howl of the wind. They huddled together, too afraid to speak, as the realization of what had just happened settled in. Chris was gone. The cabin had been something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined, and whatever was inside it had followed them into the night. As dawn broke, they finally found their way back to the edge of the forest, the cabin now far behind them. But the horror of that night clung to them, a shadow that would never leave. They never spoke of the cabin again, but each of them knew they would never forget the thing that had hunted them, the twisted creature that had taken their friend. And deep in the woods, the cabin still stood, waiting for the next group of lost souls to stumble upon its door. Ethan had always loved the thrill of solo backpacking. There was something invigorating about being alone in the wild, far away from the noise of the city and the pressures of daily life. This time, he had set his sights on a remote, fog-covered forest deep in the mountains, a place few people visited due to its isolation and treacherous trails. The locals called it the Whispering Forest and told stories of strange disappearances. But Ethan brushed them off as folklore meant to scare tourists. He was no stranger to rough terrain, and the idea of trekking through an untouched wilderness excited him. The journey started out like any other, with Ethan confidently navigating the narrow, overgrown path through the thick woods. The trees were dense, their towering trunks cloaked in moss, and a persistent fog clung to the forest floor, limiting his vision to just a few feet ahead. But the solitude didn't bother him. In fact, he welcomed it. The first day passed without incident, and as night fell, he found a small clearing to set up camp. The evening was peaceful, the only sounds the occasional hoot of an owl and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. After a quick dinner, Ethan settled into his tent, drifting off to sleep with the comfort of the wilderness surrounding him. It wasn't until the second day that things began to feel different. The morning fog was thicker than usual, casting an eerie pall over the forest. The air felt heavier, and though Ethan couldn't quite place it, there was an odd tension in the atmosphere, as if the forest itself was watching him. He shook off the feeling, chalking it up to his imagination. After all, the isolation and the fog could play tricks on anyone's mind. He continued along the path, his boots crunching on the damp leaves. But every so often, he would stop, feeling a strange prickle at the back of his neck, like someone was watching him. Every time he turned around, there was nothing there but the impenetrable fog and the towering trees. By late afternoon, that sense of unease had grown into a gnawing fear. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched anymore. Ethan began to hear things. At first, it was subtle. The faint snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves in the underbrush, sounds that could easily be attributed to animals. But as the hours passed, the noises became more distinct, more deliberate. Footsteps, not his own. They were slow and measured, always a few paces behind him, never too close, but never far enough away for him to ignore. Ethan quickened his pace, his heart starting to race. He tried to convince himself it was just a deer or some other forest creature, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. His instincts were screaming at him to get out of the forest, but the path ahead seemed endless, the fog growing denser with each step. Every time he stopped to listen, the footsteps would stop as well, as though whatever was following him knew he was aware of it. As dusk began to settle over the forest, the feeling of being hunted became impossible to ignore. Ethan glanced around nervously, gripping the strap of his backpack as if it could somehow offer protection. The fog had thickened to the point where he could barely see a few feet in front of him, and the trees seemed to close in around him, their dark forms looming like silent sentinels. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as the footsteps behind him grew louder, more persistent. Whatever was out there was no longer bothering to hide its presence. In a panic, Ethan broke into a run, his boots slipping on the damp ground as he sprinted through the forest. Branches whipped against his face, and the fog swirled around him, disorienting him as he veered off the trail. The footsteps followed, faster now, almost a rhythmic echo of his own, always just out of sight, but far too close for comfort. Ethan's chest burned with exertion, but he didn't dare stop, not even to look back. Every fiber of his being told him that whatever was following him would catch him if he did. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled into another clearing, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The fog was lighter here, and for a moment, he allowed himself to hope that he had lost whatever had been chasing him. He doubled over, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest, but the relief was short-lived. As the silence settled around him, he realized with growing horror that the footsteps had stopped. Not behind him, but ahead. Something was standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, hidden in the shadows between the trees. Ethan froze, his blood turning to ice. He could see the faint outline of a figure, barely discernible through the fog. It stood perfectly still, watching him. Its eyes, oh God, the eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the last of the dying light. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't know what it was, but every instinct told him to run, to get as far away from it as possible. But his body wouldn't move. He was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a fear so intense it felt as though the forest itself had wrapped its tendrils around him, holding him in place. For what felt like hours, the figure did nothing. It simply stood there, watching, waiting. Then, slowly, it began to move, not toward him but around him, circling the clearing with deliberate, predatory steps. The fog seemed to thicken around it, shrouding its form in a shifting veil of mist. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away, his eyes never leaving the figure. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sounds, but he knew it was still there, stalking him. He stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch and landing hard on the ground. The figure stopped, its glowing eyes fixed on him, unblinking. Panic surged through Ethan as he scrambled to his feet, his body finally responding to the desperate need to flee. He bolted into the forest, not caring which direction he ran, as long as it was away from the thing that had been following him. The branches tore at his clothes, the fog swirling around him like a living entity, but he didn't stop. The footsteps returned, louder and faster than before, closing in on him. Ethan's vision blurred with tears and sweat, his muscles screaming in agony, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in tighter with every step. And the footsteps, they were right behind him now, almost in sync with his own, like a shadow that he couldn't shake. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath him. Ethan let out a cry as he tumbled down a steep embankment, his body slamming against rocks and roots before coming to a stop at the bottom. Pain shot through his limbs, but he forced himself to get up, his vision swimming. The fog was thinner here, and for a brief moment he thought he might have finally escaped. But then he heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps, descending the embankment behind him. Ethan's body trembled with fear as he looked up, and there, standing at the top of the slope, was the figure. Its glowing eyes bore into him, cold and emotionless. It took a step forward, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He tried to crawl backward, but his body was too battered, too exhausted to move. The figure descended slowly, its movements fluid and unnatural, like a predator toying with its prey. As it reached the bottom of the slope, Ethan could finally see it clearly. The figure was humanoid but twisted, its limbs too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly, casting a sickly light on its grotesque form. It crouched low, staring at Ethan with a terrifying intensity, as if it were savoring the fear radiating from him. Ethan's heart raced, his mind screaming for him to do something, anything. But he was frozen, trapped by the creature's gaze. It leaned closer, its breath cold and rancid on his face. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. The last thing Ethan saw before darkness claimed him was the figure's glowing eyes, burning into his soul as it dragged him into the fog, where no one would ever find him. When a search party arrived days later, they found nothing but Ethan's backpack, lying abandoned in a small clearing. The forest was silent, as it always had been. But to those who ventured too deep, it was said that the fog still carried whispers, and the eyes in the darkness were always watching, waiting for the next lone traveler to wander into their grasp. There was a place, hidden deep in the heart of the countryside, where the trees grew so tall and thick that the sunlight could barely penetrate their canopy. This was the cursed forest of the Forgotten Souls, a place shrouded in mystery and fear. For generations, the local villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, warning travelers never to set foot inside its boundaries. They said that once you entered, the forest would claim you, and you would never return. Over the years, countless people had disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the trees and the dark secrets that lay within. No bodies were ever found, no signs of struggle. It was as if the forest itself consumed them, leaving nothing behind but their stories and the cold chill of their absence. The legend spoke of an ancient curse born from a tragedy long forgotten. Centuries ago, the land had been home to a thriving village, nestled on the edge of the forest. But one fateful night, a terrible fire swept through the village, consuming everything in its path. No one survived. It was said that the souls of the villagers, unable to find peace, wandered into the forest, their anguished spirits merging with the trees. Over time, the forest became a living entity, its roots entwined with the souls of the forgotten dead, hungry for more. Those who ventured into its depths were doomed to join the lost, becoming part of the cursed land itself. Despite the warnings, there were always a few brave or foolish souls who sought to uncover the truth behind the curse. Some were driven by curiosity, others by a need to disprove the legend, but none had ever returned. And so the forest remained an enigma, a place feared and avoided by all who lived near it. One autumn evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of purple and the wind whispered through the trees, a lone traveler arrived in the village that bordered the cursed forest. His name was Marcus, and he was not like the other travelers who passed through. He had heard the stories of the cursed forest many times before, but unlike the villagers, he did not fear it. In fact, he was drawn to it, A scholar by trade, Marcus had spent years researching ancient folklore, and the legend of the forgotten souls fascinated him. He had come to the village with one purpose: to uncover the truth. The villagers, upon hearing of his plan, begged him to reconsider. "The forest is not a place for the living," the village elder warned him, his wrinkled face pale with fear. "Once you enter, it will not let you leave. You will become like the others, lost, forgotten." But Marcus was determined. He had heard these warnings before, in every village that bordered the forest. Yet no one could provide proof of the curse, only stories passed down through the generations. He believed it was all superstition, a myth born from the fear of the unknown. That night, despite the villagers' pleas, Marcus set out alone toward the forest. The air was cool, and the moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the trees. As he approached the edge of the forest, a sense of unease settled over him. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches twisting together like gnarled fingers. But Marcus shook off the feeling and pressed forward. He had come too far to turn back now. The forest was eerily quiet as Marcus made his way along the narrow, overgrown path. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath his boots and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick, and a strange, unnatural fog began to creep along the forest floor, swirling around his feet. It was then that Marcus began to hear it, the faintest sound of voices, just beyond the edge of hearing. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him. But as he ventured deeper into the woods, the voices grew clearer. They were soft, almost like whispers, but filled with an unmistakable sadness. "Help us, we are lost." Marcus stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned in a circle, scanning the trees around him, but there was no one there. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. His rational mind told him to leave, to go back to the safety of the village, but another part of him, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, urged him to continue. He had come here for answers, and now it seemed that the forest was offering them to him. As Marcus ventured further into the forest, the voices grew louder, more desperate. The fog thickened, swirling around him like a living thing, and the trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out as if trying to pull him in. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on him, as though the very air was alive with the souls of the lost. He had read about places like this, places where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, but experiencing it was something else entirely. The air was charged with energy, thick with sorrow and pain. Every step felt like a struggle, as though the forest itself was resisting his presence. Suddenly, the path beneath his feet disappeared, swallowed by the fog, and Marcus found himself in a large clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, ancient tree, its trunk blackened and twisted. The air around it seemed to shimmer with a strange, otherworldly light, and the voices grew louder, more insistent. "Join us." Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. The tree was covered in faces, twisted, anguished faces, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the faces of the lost souls, forever trapped within the tree, their bodies and spirits bound to the cursed land. The tree pulsed with a dark, malevolent energy, and Marcus could feel it tugging at him, pulling him closer. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. It was as if the forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others before him. The fog thickened, swirling around the clearing, and the whispers became a deafening roar. The faces on the tree twisted in agony, their eyes filled with a desperate hunger. Marcus fell to his knees, his vision blurring as the weight of the curse settled over him. He could feel the forest reaching into his mind, pulling at his memories, erasing them one by one. He realized then why no one had ever returned from the forest. It wasn't that they had disappeared, it was that they had become part of the forest itself, their souls absorbed by the curse, forgotten by the world. As the last of his strength faded, Marcus looked up at the tree one final time. The faces stared back at him, their expressions twisted in eternal torment. He understood now. The curse was real, and there was no escaping it. He had become one of the forgotten, another lost soul claimed by the cursed forest. The villagers never saw Marcus again. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of him. They knew better than to search for him, for the forest had claimed him, as it always did. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind blew just right, they could still hear the whispers from the trees, voices of the forgotten, calling out for help that would never come. And so, the legend of the cursed forest of the forgotten souls lived on, a dark reminder of the dangers that lurked within its depths, waiting to claim those foolish enough to seek its secrets. For as long as anyone could remember, the deep woods at the edge of the town of Hemlock had been a place of whispered fear. The forest stretched on for miles, its trees towering so high they seemed to block out the very sky. It was said that strange things lurked within its shadowy depths, things that were neither human nor animal, creatures that defied explanation. Over the years, stories had circulated about hunters, hikers, and wanderers who had entered the forest and never returned, their disappearances blamed on the creature of the deep woods, a monstrous being that roamed the forest, waiting for anyone foolish enough to venture too far into its domain. Most people in the town dismissed the stories as mere legend, but there were always a few who believed, and there were always a few who disappeared. Mark Anders was not one to believe in legends. A seasoned outdoorsman, he had spent most of his life exploring forests, mountains, and rivers. He scoffed at the tales of monsters in the woods and brushed off the warnings from the locals. To him, the deep woods were just another challenge, another place to explore. He had traveled to Hemlock specifically because of the forest, intrigued by its isolation and the prospect of being the first in years to map its farthest reaches. Ignoring the protests of the townspeople, he packed his gear and set out one crisp autumn morning, determined to prove that the stories were nothing more than superstition. The first few hours of Mark's trek were uneventful. The forest was dense, its canopy thick with leaves that had turned a deep shade of gold and red. The air was cool, and the sound of birds chirping echoed through the trees. Mark felt completely at ease, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of nature. But as the day wore on, something began to change. The deeper he went into the forest, the quieter it became. The birdsong faded, and even the wind seemed to stop, leaving only an eerie, oppressive silence in its place. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The ground beneath his feet became soft and uneven, as though the earth itself was sick. Despite the growing sense of unease, Mark pressed on, determined to reach the heart of the woods before setting up camp. But with every step, the feeling of being watched intensified. At first, he shrugged it off as paranoia, but soon it became impossible to ignore. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his instinct screamed at him to turn back. He scanned the trees around him, looking for signs of wildlife, but saw nothing. No deer, no squirrels, not even a bird perched on a branch. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Mark found a small clearing where he decided to set up camp. He built a fire, hoping its warmth and light would chase away the strange tension that had settled over him. But as darkness fell, the sense of unease only grew stronger. The silence was absolute, unnaturally thick, and every now and then, he thought he could hear the faintest sound, something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing, out of sight. It was subtle at first, just the occasional snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves, but then it became more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the perimeter of the clearing. Mark's heart began to pound in his chest. He stood up, gripping his flashlight tightly as he scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing eerily through the trees. There was no response, just the steady, rhythmic crunch of footsteps in the distance. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but the thick trees and underbrush obscured whatever or whoever was out there. For the first time in years, Mark felt true fear. Something was watching him. Something was waiting. And then he saw it. Just a glimpse at first, a shadowy figure darting between the trees, too fast to make out clearly. Mark's blood ran cold as the figure appeared again, closer this time. It wasn't human. Its movements were too quick, too fluid, and there was something unnatural about its shape. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, thin limbs that seemed to bend in ways that no animal or human could. Its eyes, oh God, its eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the firelight like twin orbs of molten gold. Mark backed away, his heart racing as the creature emerged from the trees, stepping into the edge of the firelight. It was grotesque, a horrifying blend of human and animal, but not fully either. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bony frame. Its arms were too long, its legs too thin, and its face was a twisted mockery of something human, with sharp, angular features and wide, lidless eyes that stared at Mark with a hungry, predatory intensity. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that glistened in the firelight. For a moment, neither Mark nor the creature moved, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, it lunged. Mark barely had time to react, diving out of the way as the creature swiped at him with its long, clawed fingers. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the nearest thing he could find, a thick branch from the fire, and swung it wildly at the creature. The branch connected with a sickening thud, but the creature barely flinched. It let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing as it stalked toward him again. Mark's mind raced. He had no idea what this thing was or how to fight it. All he knew was that he had to get out of there. He threw the branch at the creature and sprinted toward the trees, his heart pounding in his chest as he ran. Behind him, he could hear the creature's footsteps, fast and relentless, its breathing heavy and ragged as it chased him through the forest. Branches whipped against his face, and the uneven ground threatened to trip him with every step, but he didn't dare slow down. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as Mark ran blindly through the darkness. Every now and then he would catch a glimpse of the creature out of the corner of his eye, moving through the trees like a shadow, always just behind him. It was toying with him, letting him think he could escape before closing in again. Finally, Mark's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. He knew he couldn't run anymore. He was too tired, too weak. He turned to face the creature, his body trembling with fear as it slowly emerged from the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on him. It crouched low, preparing to strike, and for a moment Mark thought this was the end. But then something strange happened. The creature stopped, its head tilting to one side as if listening to something Mark couldn't hear. Its eyes flickered, and for a moment its predatory expression softened, almost as if it was confused. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Mark lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. When he finally gathered the strength to stand, he found himself completely alone. The forest was still, the oppressive silence lifting as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. Shaken and exhausted, Mark made his way back to the village, his mind reeling from the encounter. He never spoke of what he had seen to the villagers, but he didn't need to. They knew. They had always known. The creature of the deep woods was real, and it wasn't human, nor was it animal. It was something far older, far more dangerous, and it still lurked in the darkest parts of the forest, waiting for the next traveler to stray too far. Mark never returned to the woods, and he knew deep down that if he had stayed a moment longer, neither would he. The morning sun was bright as 5 friends, Alyssa, Ben, Sarah, Lucas, and Jason, set out for what was supposed to be a fun and simple weekend hiking trip. They had chosen Pine Hollow Forest, a sprawling woodland they'd never explored before, but had heard was full of scenic trails and peaceful surroundings. The dense canopy overhead filtered the sunlight, casting dappled patterns on the ground as they walked, their laughter and banter echoing through the trees. The air was crisp, filled with the fresh scent of pine and earth, and they felt a sense of freedom as they left behind the stresses of their daily lives. The group followed the marked trail for hours, enjoying the beauty of the forest as the path wound through towering trees and trickling streams. But as the afternoon wore on, they stumbled upon something strange. An unmarked path branching off the main trail, hidden behind a curtain of vines and thick underbrush. It was narrow, barely visible, as if nature had tried to reclaim it over the years. "Hey guys, look at this," Ben called out, pushing the vines aside. "This wasn't on the map." Jason, always up for adventure, grinned. Maybe it leads to something cool. We should check it out. Alyssa hesitated, glancing at the others. I don't know, guys. We weren't planning on going off the trail. But her reluctance was quickly dismissed by Lucas and Sarah, who were equally curious. Come on, Sarah urged. It'll be fun. It's just a quick detour. Reluctantly, Alyssa agreed, and the group turned onto the hidden path, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. At first, the new trail seemed like any other, narrow but walkable, with the trees standing tall and silent around them. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, something changed. The air grew cooler, and the forest seemed to close in on them. The trees, once inviting, now felt menacing, their twisted branches reaching overhead like claws. The sunlight that had warmed their faces earlier was now barely penetrating the thick canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The path itself became harder to follow, narrowing further until it was little more than a dirt trail winding through the thick underbrush. As the hours passed, the group grew uneasy. Does anyone else feel like we've been walking in circles? Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Ben glanced around, frowning. It does feel like we're going in the same direction over and over. We should have hit a clearing by now. Jason pulled out his map and compass, frustration flashing across his face as he tried to figure out where they had gone wrong. This doesn't make any sense, he muttered. We've been following the same direction, but the compass keeps spinning. It's like it can't find north. Alyssa felt a chill run down her spine. Maybe we should turn back, she suggested. We could retrace our steps to the main trail. But when they turned to head back, the path behind them was gone. The trail they had been following had disappeared, swallowed by the forest. There was no sign of the way they had come, just a wall of trees and tangled vines. Panic set in as the realization hit them. They were lost, and the forest itself seemed to be shifting around them. What the hell, Lucas said, his voice trembling. We were just here. How can the path be gone? Alyssa's heart raced as she looked around, her mind struggling to make sense of the situation. The forest was silent now, eerily so, as if the very air had thickened with an unnatural stillness. There was no sound of birds, no rustle of animals in the underbrush, only the faint whisper of the wind through the leaves, like the forest itself was watching them. We need to stay calm, Ben said, trying to sound reassuring, though the fear in his voice was clear. Let's keep moving. There has to be a way out. But the deeper they went, the more twisted and confusing the forest became. The trees seemed to move when they weren't looking, rearranging themselves into new shapes and patterns. The path they were on would split into two, then four, then merge back into one, but it never led them anywhere familiar. Every turn they took brought them back to the same point, a maddening loop that left them disoriented and exhausted. Hours passed, though it felt like days, and the sun, once high in the sky, was now barely a faint glow behind the dense cover of leaves, casting the forest in a perpetual twilight. As night began to fall, the group's panic turned to desperation. They hadn't packed for more than a day's hike, and their water and food were running low. The temperature dropped sharply, and the forest, which had once felt like a place of adventure, now felt like a prison. This can't be real, Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. It's like the forest is alive, like it doesn't want us to leave. Jason, normally the fearless leader, was now visibly shaken. There's no logic to this, it's impossible, he muttered, pacing back and forth. We've gone in every direction, but nothing makes sense. We're trapped. In the growing darkness, strange sounds began to echo through the trees. Low creaks, distant whispers, and the occasional snap of a branch, as if something was moving just beyond their line of sight. Alyssa clutched her arms around herself, feeling a presence lurking in the shadows. Whatever it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that watched them from the edges of the twisted forest, waiting. They built a small fire, hoping its light would keep the darkness at bay, but the forest seemed to close in even tighter. The flames flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the trees. No one spoke as they sat around the fire, their faces pale and drawn with exhaustion and fear. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a branch, sent a jolt of terror through the group. They felt like prey, and whatever was hunting them was closing in. As the night dragged on, the forest became a maze of nightmares. The paths that appeared during the day were now twisting into impossible shapes, leading nowhere. It was as if the forest itself had become a living maze, shifting and changing with every step they took, designed to trap them forever. And the presence, whatever it was, grew bolder. They could hear it now, moving in the darkness, just out of reach. Its footsteps slow and deliberate, as if savoring their fear. Around midnight, the fire sputtered and died, plunging the group into complete darkness. "We need to keep moving," Jason said, his voice shaky but determined. "We can't stay here. It's watching us." But as they tried to find a new path, the forest seemed to resist. Every direction they took brought them back to the same spot, the clearing where the fire had been, as if the forest itself was toying with them, leading them in circles. By dawn, they were exhausted, their minds frayed by fear and confusion. The paths had completely disappeared now, and they were trapped in an endless sea of trees that stretched on forever. "We're not getting out, are we?" Ben said quietly, his face pale. Alyssa didn't answer. She didn't have to. They all knew the truth. The forest wasn't just a place. It was alive, a labyrinth designed to confuse and trap anyone who dared to enter. And now it had them. As the sun rose, casting its pale light through the twisted branches, the group realized they were not alone. Shadows moved between the trees, tall, thin figures that seemed to melt into the forest itself. They were the lost souls of those who had wandered too far, drawn into the maze and never allowed to leave. Their hollow eyes watched the hikers, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Alyssa shuddered, backing away as one of the figures stepped closer. It reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers brushing against her arm. The touch was cold, like ice, and in that moment she understood. They were already part of the forest. There was no escape. The last thing Alyssa saw before the forest swallowed them whole was the path disappearing one final time, fading into the shadows as if it had never existed at all. And the forest remained, waiting for the next group of hikers to stumble into its grasp, lost forever in the disappearing paths of the deep woods. The night was calm, the sky a blanket of stars, as a group of friends, Emma, Tyler, Mia, Jake, and Olivia, hiked through the dense woods, their footsteps crunching softly on the leaf-strewn ground. They were seasoned campers, having spent countless weekends venturing into the wilderness. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. The air was cooler than usual for midsummer, and the forest around them seemed quieter, as though it was holding its breath. After hours of trekking through the fading light, they decided it was time to set up camp. But just as they were about to clear a spot for their tents, they noticed something strange, a faint, flickering light in the distance. "Is that a campfire?" Jake asked, squinting through the trees. The others stopped, exchanging puzzled glances. "Looks like it," Mia said, her voice hesitant. "But we're supposed to be the only ones out here, right? I didn't think anyone else took this trail." Olivia checked the map and nodded. "Yeah, this part of the forest is pretty remote. We should have been alone." Curiosity piqued, they decided to investigate, thinking perhaps some other campers had set up nearby. As they drew closer, they saw that it was indeed a campfire, but something was off. The fire was already lit, crackling merrily in the center of a small clearing, casting a warm, inviting glow. Yet there was no sign of people, no tents, no backpacks, not even a trace of footprints in the soft earth around the flames. The campsite was completely deserted, save for the fire, which burned as though it had been tended only moments ago. "Maybe someone just went for a walk or to get more firewood," Emma suggested, though her tone was uncertain. Tyler frowned, stepping closer to the fire. "If someone's out here, where's their gear? No one lights a fire and leaves without their stuff." His words hung in the air, and a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature swept through the group. Jake looked around the clearing, scanning the dark forest beyond the reach of the firelight. "It feels like someone's watching us," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The others exchanged uneasy glances, and Olivia, always the cautious one, suggested they leave. "Maybe we should go back to our original spot and set up camp there. This is weird." But before they could move, a soft rustling sound came from the trees on the far side of the clearing. The friends froze, their eyes darting toward the noise. The fire crackled louder, as if in response to the disturbance. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her face pale in the flickering light. Another rustle, followed by the distinct sound of something, or someone, moving through the underbrush. The forest, which had been unnervingly silent moments ago, now seemed to come alive with the sounds of branches snapping and leaves rustling, though none of them could see what was making the noise. Emma stepped closer to the fire, her eyes wide with confusion. "Whoever lit this fire is still out there," she said, her voice trembling. "We should leave now." But just as they turned to go, something even stranger happened. The flames of the fire dimmed suddenly, as though a strong wind had blown over them, but the air around them remained still. The once bright flames flickered weakly, casting eerie, distorted shadows across the clearing. And then they heard it. Soft, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. Whispering, low, indecipherable voices carried on the breeze, seeming to come from all directions at once. "What the hell is that?" Tyler asked, his eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but no matter how hard they tried, none of them could make out what the voices were saying. It was like the forest itself was speaking, murmuring secrets in a language that was just beyond their understanding. Olivia backed away, her hands trembling. "This isn't right. There's something wrong here. We need to get out of here." The group started to move, but before they could take more than a few steps, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was barely more than a shadow, just a shape in the darkness, but they all saw it. A tall, thin figure standing motionless at the edge of the trees, watching them. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic now, and the fire, which had nearly died down, flared back to life in a burst of bright flames, casting a blinding light that forced them to shield their eyes. When they looked again, the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered, his voice shaking. "There was someone there, right there." No one had an answer. The fire continued to burn brightly, but the clearing was as empty as before, save for the friends, who now stood frozen with fear. "We need to leave," Olivia said again, her voice tight. "Now." But as they turned to go, the path they had come from seemed to shift. The trees, which had formed a clear line back to the trail, now seemed to close in on them, their gnarled branches twisting together like a living wall. The forest, once a place of adventure and peace, now felt like a trap. They hurried back the way they came, moving quickly through the thick underbrush. But no matter how far they walked, they couldn't find the main trail. The whispers continued, growing louder and more disorienting, echoing around them like a chorus of voices just out of reach. Every time they thought they saw a break in the trees, it would vanish, replaced by more tangled branches and darkness. As the night wore on, the fear in the group grew palpable. They were no longer just lost. They were being hunted, stalked by something unseen, something that had lured them in with the promise of warmth and light. The fire they had found wasn't just a campfire. It was a beacon, a trap set by something that wasn't human. Hours passed, though it felt like days, and the group became more frantic, their movements more desperate. They tried to retrace their steps, but every turn led them back to the same place, the clearing with the campfire, still burning as brightly as ever, though no one had fed it any wood. It was as if the forest was playing a cruel game, leading them in circles, always bringing them back to the place where they had first been lured. "I don't understand," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "Why can't we get out?" The others didn't respond. They were too tired, too terrified to think clearly. And then, as the fire crackled softly behind them, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than before. This time, the words were unmistakable. "Stay, with us, forever." The group froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air grew colder, and a heavy, oppressive presence seemed to settle over them, pressing down on their lungs, making it hard to breathe. They could feel it now, whatever it was that had lit the fire, whatever had been watching them from the shadows. It was close, too close, and it wasn't going to let them leave. In the end, no one in the village saw the group of friends again. When search parties went looking for them days later, they found no sign of a camp, no footprints, and no trace of a fire. The forest remained silent, as it always had, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But the villagers knew better than to enter the woods at night, for they had heard the stories before. Stories of fires that burned without wood, of voices that whispered from the shadows, and of those who disappeared, lured in by something that was not human. And in the heart of the woods, the ghostly campfire still flickered, waiting for the next group of travelers to find it, to be drawn in by its warm, welcoming glow, and to join the voices of those who had never returned. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.